The oak doors of Manhattan Supreme Court groaned under their own weight, a sound that had swallowed 1,000 lives and spat out half as many futures. Inside courtroom 304, the air smelled of lemon polish and the particular kind of silence that comes before a verdict. Marcus Stone checked his reflection in the glass partition separating the gallery from the well, straightening a tie that cost more than most men earned in a week. Italian silk, charcoal gray. The knot sat perfect against his throat, a small monument to his own precision. 90%. The number rolled through his mind like a slot machine hitting jackpot. 90% of the liquid assets. Full control of Stone Logistics. The Hampton House with its 8 bedrooms and that view of the Atlantic that made investors weep with envy. And Elena, his soon-to-be ex-wife, would walk away with alimony that barely covered rent in a decent zip code and a Honda with 100,000 miles on the odometer. He had won. Robert Crane sat beside him organizing documents with the methodical care of a man who billed by the quarter hour. The lawyer's silver hair caught the fluorescent light, and when he leaned close, his cologne carried notes of cedar and old money. The words came low, conspiratorial. She folded completely. I expected at least some fight over the intellectual property, but her counsel didn't even push back on the equity split. Marcus allowed himself a smile. He pulled out his phone, thumbs moving across the screen with practiced ease. Done deal. Champagne at Plaza 1 p.m. The message went to Jessica. 28, blonde in that effortless way that suggested good genes and better Pilates executive assistant with ambitions that extended exactly as far as Marcus's wallet could carry them. 6 months they'd been together, though together felt like the wrong word for what they were. Convenient, discreet, willing. He hit send and watched the blue checkmark appear. Delivered. Read. Across the aisle, Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for detention to end. Navy dress. Hair pulled back so tight it had to hurt. No jewelry, not even the diamond studs he'd bought for their 5th anniversary, the ones that were supposed to apologize for missing her birthday because a client dinner in Boston had run long. She looked smaller than he remembered, defeated. The public defender beside her, some kid named Timothy Brooks, who couldn't have been more than 5 years out of law school, kept dropping his pen and picking it up, dropping it and picking it up, a nervous tick that made Marcus want to reach across the aisle and snap the pen in half. The judge, Evelyn Parker, a woman whose reputation for impatience preceded her like a storm front, peered over reading glasses that sat low on her nose. Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 similar proceedings. We are here for the final decree of dissolution in the matter of Stone versus Stone. I have reviewed the settlement agreement. A pause, the kind that made lawyers shift in their seats. It appears heavily weighted toward the defendant, Mr. Stone. Mrs. Stone, are you certain you understand what you're signing? New York is an equitable distribution state. You are entitled to a fair share of marital assets. Elena stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, like someone rising from deep water. When she spoke, her voice came out flat, drained of color. I understand, Your Honor. I just want this to be over. I want a clean break. I'm willing to sign. Marcus felt a rush of something close to euphoria. It was happening. Actually happening. He'd built Stone Logistics from nothing. Well, from an idea and Elena's code, but ideas were what mattered, and the code had been basic stuff, foundational work that any competent programmer could have written. He'd been the one to sell it, to schmooze the investors, to land the Pentagon contract worth $400 million over 5 years. That was vision. That was empire building. Elena had been support, background, the kind of partner who kept the engine running while he drove the car. Judge Parker lifted her gavel. If there are no further objections or witnesses to be heard regarding asset distribution. The doors. They didn't open so much as surrender to the force applied against them. The sound was wrong, too loud for the quiet tension of the courtroom, and every head turned as if pulled by the same string. A man stood in the doorway. Old. That was Marcus's first thought. 70, maybe older, with steel gray hair beneath a flat cap that looked like it had been purchased during the Carter administration. Wool overcoat, dark green and worn at the elbows. Workman's boots that had seen actual work. A wooden cane not for show but for the kind of balance that comes when bones get tired of holding up the same frame for 7 decades. Marcus recognized him instantly. Henry Blackwell, Elena's father, the watchmaker from Brooklyn who lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Williamsburg and drove a car so old it still had a cassette player. They'd met exactly twice, once at the wedding 10 years ago, once at a Christmas dinner 7 years back, that had been so awkward Marcus had invented a work emergency to escape early. The wedding. Marcus remembered that clearly because Henry had given him a gift that had seemed bizarrely expensive for a man who fixed clocks for a living. A pocket watch, vintage, heavy, with intricate engravings on the case. Marcus had nodded and smiled and said all the right things, but 2 weeks later he'd looked up the model online and nearly choked. Patek Philippe, 1952. Collectors were selling them for $40,000, sometimes $50,000. He'd taken it to a pawn shop a year later. The guy behind the counter had offered $800 cash, no questions. Marcus had used the money to buy a set of Callaway irons and told Elena he'd put the watch in a safety deposit box for safekeeping. Now Henry Blackwell stood in the doorway of a Manhattan courtroom, and the air seemed to shift around him like he'd brought the weather in from outside. Marcus couldn't help it. He laughed, a short bark of sound that echoed off the wood paneling. "Your Honor, this is my father-in-law. He fixes clocks in Brooklyn. I think he's confused about—" "I object." Henry's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Deep, resonant, the kind of tone that suggested a man who'd spent decades speaking and being heard. "I object to the distribution of assets, specifically the distribution of assets that do not belong to Mr. Stone to begin with." Judge Parker set down her gavel with theatrical slowness. Her eyebrows rose, and for a moment she looked almost entertained. "Sir, this is a closed hearing. Who are you, and what standing do you claim?" Henry moved forward, the cane clicking against the parquet floor in a rhythm that felt almost musical. He didn't look at Marcus, didn't acknowledge the lawyers or the stenographer or the bailiff whose hand had drifted toward his belt out of habit. Henry's eyes stayed fixed on the bench. "I am Henry Blackwell, father of the plaintiff, and I am the actual owner of the property Mr. Stone is attempting to claim." The laugh died in Marcus's throat. Robert Crane sat up straighter, his face shifting from relaxed confidence to the particular alertness of a lawyer who'd just heard a grenade pin hit the floor. Marcus stood his chair, scraping loud against the floor. "Your Honor, this is absurd. My father-in-law is obviously distraught about the divorce. He's a retired watchmaker from Queens, Brooklyn. He doesn't have standing here. Robert, can we please remove him before this gets more embarrassing?" Robert was already on his feet, buttoning his suit jacket with one hand while the other reached for his briefcase. "Your Honor, Mr. Blackwell has no legal standing in this proceeding. He is not a party to the marriage or the dissolution thereof. This is clearly an emotional response to—" "Sit down, Mr. Crane." Judge Parker's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. She leaned forward, her attention fixed entirely on Henry. "Mr. Blackwell, you claim ownership. That is a bold statement. Mr. Stone is the registered CEO and founder of Stone Logistics. The deed to the Hampton property is in his name. Please explain." Henry reached into his overcoat. The bailiff tensed, and for a surreal moment Marcus thought the old man might actually pull out a weapon. Instead, Henry withdrew a leather folder, thick old, the kind of thing you'd find in an estate sale. The leather was cracked and faded, tied with a red string that had lost most of its color to time. Henry didn't hand it to the bailiff, didn't approach the bench. He simply tossed the folder onto the defense table where Marcus stood. It landed with a heavy thud that knocked over Marcus's water glass, sending liquid spreading across the polished wood in a slow-motion catastrophe. Marcus jumped back to avoid the water, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs in a way that felt wildly disproportionate to the moment. "What is this? This is harassment, Your Honor. Open it." Elena's voice. Marcus's head snapped toward her, and for the first time since entering the courtroom he actually looked at his wife. Really looked. Her expression hadn't changed, still calm, still resigned, but her eyes. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't identify, something cold and patient and utterly foreign to the woman he thought he'd married. "Open it, Marcus." Robert leaned over, already reaching for the folder, and Marcus wanted to stop him, wanted to object, wanted to do anything except watch his lawyer untie the red string and flip open the cover. But he stood, frozen water from the spilled glass seeping into the Italian leather of his shoes. The first page wasn't a legal document. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly faded, showing a younger Henry Blackwell, hair still dark, face unlined, standing beside a man Marcus recognized from history books and Forbes retrospectives. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. They were shaking hands in front of what looked like a naval shipyard, and both men were smiling the way people smile when a deal worth millions has just closed. Marcus felt something cold slide down his spine. "Nice picture. So you met a famous guy once. That proves nothing." His voice came out wrong, too defensive, too sharp. "Turn the page." Henry hadn't moved from his position in the center aisle. He stood like a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. Robert turned the page. It was a deed of trust, dated 15 years earlier, 5 years before Marcus had even met Elena. The header read, "Blackwell Family Blind Trust," in formal legal script, and beneath it page after page of dense legal language that Marcus's brain tried to process and couldn't. Robert's face went white, actually white, like someone had drained all the blood from his head in a single instant. His hand trembled as he held the document, and when he looked up at Marcus, his expression carried the specific horror of a lawyer who has just realized his client is about to be destroyed by paperwork he should have found months ago. "Marcus." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Did you ever run a title search on the Hampton property going back more than 10 years? Why would I bought it from a shell company in the Caymans. It was a steal. The whole deal closed in 3 weeks. You told me it was clean. Read the beneficiary clause." Henry's voice cut across their whispered panic, calm and precise as a scalpel. Marcus grabbed the document from Robert's hands. His eyes scanned the page legal jargon, blurring together until one section jumped out with terrible clarity. The assets held by the Blackwell Family Blind Trust, including all real estate holdings and intellectual property assigned to the subsidiary Vector Prime LLC, remain the sole property of the trust until the beneficiary, Elena Marie Blackwell, reaches the age of 45, or upon the dissolution of her marriage, at which point all assets revert to direct control of the trust's executive, Henry James Blackwell. Marcus read it again, then again. The words didn't change. "I don't understand. Vector Prime, that's the back-end code. That's the core of my software." Henry smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Your software, Marcus, you're a salesman. You couldn't code a microwave timer if your life depended on it. When you started your company 10 years ago, you needed a back-end. Elena gave it to you. The code she wrote, the encryption algorithms, the logistics optimization protocols, all of it came from Vector Prime LLC. Marcus shook his head, the motion jerky and desperate. "She gave me some basic script. I built the empire. I secured the investors. I landed the Pentagon contract. That's my work. You signed a licensing agreement." Henry took a step forward, close enough now that Marcus could see the web of fine lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands that spoke of decades of precision work. 10 years ago, when you were scrambling for funding, when you were 2 weeks away from bankruptcy and living in that studio apartment in Astoria, Elena gave you a stack of papers. Do you remember? You were in such a rush to close the seed round that you signed everything she put in front of you without reading. The memory surfaced like a body from deep water. Late night. Pizza boxes stacked on the counter. Elena at the kitchen table with documents spread out in front of her saying something about corporate structure and liability protection. Marcus had been on the phone with an investor, pacing, pitching, barely paying attention. Elena had slid papers across to him one by one, and he'd signed them while talking, while eating, while mentally calculating how many shares he'd have to give up to hit the $2 million target. That license was revocable. Henry's words landed like stones in still water. Revocable upon dissolution of marriage. Revocable upon my discretion as trust executor. Revocable instantly, Marcus. And I am revoking it now. The courtroom had gone silent except for the sound of the stenographer's fingers on her machine and the bailiff's slight shift of weight that made his leather holster creak. Marcus looked at Robert. Robert looked at his phone, fingers flying across the screen, pulling up corporate registries and property records with the frantic energy of a man trying to patch a hull breach with his bare hands. "I'm checking the holding company for the Hampton House now." "Oh, God." Robert's voice cracked on the last word. "It links back. The Cayman Shell Company is owned by a Delaware LLC, which is owned by Blackwell Holdings. Marcus, they own the patent numbers. They own the IP. Every line of code running on your servers right now." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. His hand shot out to grip the table, fingers digging into wood that suddenly felt like the only solid thing in a universe gone liquid. What does that mean? He already knew. He could see it in Robert's face, in the way the lawyer's eyes had gone distant and calculating, already running through malpractice scenarios and bar association complaints. It means without their license, Stone Logistics is just an empty shell selling pirated software. The Pentagon contract was awarded based on the capabilities of Vector Prime code. If they revoke the license, the contract is void. You'll be sued for fraud. Federal procurement fraud, Marcus. That's 20 years minimum. The room spun. Marcus's vision narrowed to a tunnel, all sound retreating to a distant hum. 20 years. Federal prison. Everything gone. Not just the money or the company, but his freedom, his future. The very idea of Marcus Stone as someone who mattered. He turned to Henry. The old man stood watching him with an expression that wasn't quite satisfaction, wasn't quite pity. Something in between. The look of a watchmaker examining a broken mechanism and deciding whether it was worth the effort to repair. "Who are you?" The question came out as a whisper, all the bravado drained away. Henry's hand rested on the head of his cane fingers, tapping a slow rhythm against the wood. "I'm a man who fixes things, Marcus. I've spent 50 years repairing broken mechanisms, learning patience, understanding that every component matters. When my daughter brought you home 10 years ago, I watched you. I listened. You asked me what I did for a living, and when I said I repaired watches, I saw it in your eyes. Disappointment. Calculation. You were already measuring Elena's worth by her father's bank account." Henry reached into his coat again and pulled out a pocket watch. Marcus recognized it instantly, the same model, the same vintage as the one Henry had given him at the wedding. But this one looked well maintained, the gold case polished to a soft glow. "Do you know what this is worth, Marcus? $45,000. I gave you an identical one as a wedding gift. I wanted to see what you'd do with it, whether you'd treasure it because it came from family, or whether you'd sell it the moment you thought no one was looking." The accusation hung in the air, and Marcus couldn't meet Henry's eyes. "I made my fortune 40 years ago designing guidance systems for naval vessels. Sold my patents to the Defense Department in 1985 for $180 million. I retired at 42, your age now, and I spent the next decade learning watchmaking because precision interested me more than profit." Henry's voice never rose, never hardened, but each word landed with the weight of absolute certainty. "When I set up the blind trust for Elena, I built in protections, safeguards. I wanted her to have security, but I also wanted her to marry someone who loved her, not my money. So I hid it, lived simply, drove an old car, kept a workshop in Brooklyn where I could do honest work with my hands." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the courtroom like snow. "You failed the test, Marcus. You failed it the day you sold that watch. You failed it every time you diminished my daughter in front of colleagues and investors. You failed it when you signed those licensing agreements without reading them because you were too arrogant to imagine that the quiet woman doing your paperwork might be 3 steps ahead of you." Marcus's legs felt weak. He sat down hard in his chair, the leather creaking under the sudden weight. "The company, the house, everything I built, you built nothing." Elena spoke for the second time, and when Marcus looked at her, she was standing, no longer the defeated woman in the navy dress. Something had shifted in her posture and the set of her shoulders. She looked taller, stronger, like she'd been holding her breath for a decade and had finally exhaled. For 10 years, Marcus, I wrote every line of code while you took credit. I managed the server architecture while you golfed with investors. I fixed the bugs at 2 in the morning while you were—" She paused, and something like pain flickered across her face before being buried again. "While you were occupied elsewhere. You measured your worth in things you could count. Money, square footage, the 0 to 60 time on your car. If I fought you for those things, you would have fought back with everything you had. But if I gave them to you freely, if I let you think you'd won—" She trailed off, and Henry finished the thought. "Then you'd lower your guard. Arrogant men always do." Judge Parker had been silent through the entire exchange, but now she set her reading glasses on the bench and fixed Marcus with a look that could have frozen nitrogen. "Mr. Crane, I assume you need time to confer with your client." Robert stood on shaky legs. "Yes, Your Honor. We request an immediate recess." "Granted. 1 hour. Mr. Stone." "Mr. Crane, I suggest you use this time wisely. If these documents are authentic, and I have no reason to doubt they are, you're not just looking at a divorce settlement. You're looking at potential federal charges." The gavel came down. Marcus barely heard it. He was staring at the leather folder on the table, at the photograph of young Henry shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense, at the trust documents that had been sitting like a landmine under his entire life for the past decade. Elena collected her purse. Timothy Brooks, the nervous public defender who'd done nothing but drop pens for the past hour, gathered his papers with slightly more confidence now, as if he'd known all along that this was coming. As they moved toward the aisle, Marcus found his voice. "Elena." She stopped. Didn't turn around. "You knew. This whole time you knew." "Yes. The weak lawyer. The pathetic settlement. You planned to lose. I planned for you to think you'd won. There's a difference." She turned then, and the look on her face was worse than anger, worse than hatred. It was pity. "You taught me something important, Marcus. You taught me that the most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't look dangerous, the one who sits quietly while you celebrate, the one who knows exactly what you're going to do before you do it." Henry joined his daughter at the gate separating the gallery from the well. Father and daughter standing side by side, and Marcus saw the resemblance for the first time. The same calm, the same patience, the same absolute certainty that time was on their side. They walked toward the exit, Henry's cane clicking its steady rhythm against the floor. Just before they reached the doors, Elena paused and looked back. "My father taught me that a watch is only as good as its smallest gear. You forgot about the small gears, Marcus. You forgot about me." The doors closed behind them with a soft click that sounded to Marcus's ears exactly like a lock turning. The consultation room smelled of stale coffee and the particular desperation that clings to lawyers who've just watched their case implode. Robert Crane slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frosted glass panel, then rounded on Marcus with eyes that had lost all pretense of professional distance. "You told me her father was nobody. You told me he fixed clocks in a strip mall and drove a car held together with rust and prayer." Marcus paced the narrow space between the table and the wall, his hands trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. The Italian suit that had felt like armor 2 hours ago now felt like a costume, like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. "He does fix clocks. I've been to his shop. Blackwell Precision Timepieces, Williamsburg. The place has a cash register from 1987 and fluorescent lights that flicker. How was I supposed to know he was sitting on $500 million? Robert pulled out his laptop fingers, attacking the keyboard with violence usually reserved for opposing counsel. "I'm pulling the digital archives from my father's firm right now. Marcus Holloway and Associates handled estate planning for the entire Upper East Side from 1975 to 2005. If Henry Blackwell set up a trust, it'll be in here." The screen filled with scanned documents, page after page of legal boilerplate in typewriter font. Robert scrolled, stopped, scrolled again, then froze. "Here. Blackwell Family Blind Trust established 1985. My father notarized it personally. Jesus Christ, Marcus. The initial funding was $180 million from a Defense Department patent buyout. Naval Guidance Systems. Classified until 2001, then partially declassified in 2015. Marcus stopped pacing. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, and he looked older than he had that morning. Harder, like the last 2 hours had aged him a decade. The Pentagon contract, the one keeping us solvent. Robert nodded, still scrolling through documents. Vector Prime LLC owns the source code. That encryption algorithm you've been selling as proprietary technology, it's derivative of Henry's original naval work, which means if he revokes the license, the auditors will see it. They'll know I don't own the tech. Worse, federal procurement requires truthful certification of intellectual property ownership. You signed those certifications yourself, Marcus, under penalty of perjury. The room tilted. Marcus grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles going white. How long until the auditors come? They're scheduled for next Wednesday, 6 days. If those documents hold up in court, and they will because my own father notarized them, you'll be charged with fraud before the weekend's over. Marcus sank into a chair. The leather was cracked, the padding thin, and it squeaked under his weight in a way that sounded almost accusatory. Then we settle. Whatever they want. Give Elena, the company, the house, everything. Just keep the license active long enough to satisfy the Pentagon review. Robert closed his laptop with a snap that sounded like a trap springing shut. I already spoke to Timothy Brooks while you were in the bathroom. They're willing to negotiate. Something in the lawyer's tone made Marcus's stomach clench. What do they want? Everything. 100% of Stone Logistics transferred to Elena. Immediate resignation as CEO. You vacate the Hampton house by midnight tonight. In exchange, they'll grant a retroactive license for the software sufficient to cover the Pentagon contract duration. That leaves me with nothing. That leaves you with your freedom, Marcus, which is more than you deserve and significantly more than you'll have if this goes to trial. The words hung between them like smoke from a gun that had already fired. Marcus stood straightening his jacket out of pure habit muscle memory from 1,000 investor meetings where confidence was currency and hesitation was death. I need to talk to Elena. Alone. No lawyers, no fathers. Just us. Robert's laugh was bitter. You think she's going to change her mind because you ask nicely? She spent 10 years planning this, Marcus. 10 years watching you take credit for her work. Watching you make her small in front of colleagues. Watching you... He cut himself off, but Marcus knew where the sentence ended. Watching you cheat. Watching you lie. Watching you become exactly the man Henry Blackwell had suspected he'd be from the beginning. I have to try. Marcus left Robert in the consultation room and stepped into the marble hallway. The courthouse was busy with the afternoon crush lawyers in dark suits, plaintiffs in their Sunday-best court officers moving through it all with the bored efficiency of people who'd seen every human drama play out 1,000 times before. He spotted them near the windows overlooking Foley Square. Henry sat on a wooden bench reading a newspaper like he had all the time in the world. Elena stood with her back to the hallway looking out at the city below. No Timothy, no entourage, just father and daughter in a moment of quiet that Marcus was about to shatter. He approached slowly, each step feeling like he was walking toward the edge of something he couldn't see. Elena. She didn't turn immediately, just kept looking out the window, and when she finally faced him, her expression held nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the tired sadness he'd expected. Just a blankness that was somehow worse than any emotion. You have 42 minutes left of the recess. Her voice came out flat mechanical, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed until all the feeling had been wrung out. Can we talk? Just you and me? Henry set down his newspaper. The Wall Street Journal, Marcus noticed, not the local tabloid he would have expected, and his eyes tracked Marcus with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. 5 minutes. The old man's voice carried a finality that made argument impossible. Elena nodded once, then walked past Marcus toward a small alcove where vending machines hummed against the wall. Marcus followed, acutely aware of Henry's gaze on his back, like a hand between his shoulder blades. They stood facing each other across 3 feet of space that felt like continents. Elena crossed her arms, a defensive posture, and Marcus realized he'd rarely seen her stand that way. She'd always been open, available, present in a way that he'd taken for granted, and then eventually for weakness. I know I've made mistakes. The words came out sounding exactly as hollow as they were. I got lost in the pressure of building the company. The stress of competing in a market where everyone wants to see you fail. I lost sight of what mattered. Elena's expression didn't change. You practiced that, didn't you? In the bathroom mirror between meetings with Robert, trying to find the right tone, contrite but not pathetic, apologetic but still commanding. Heat flushed Marcus's face. I mean it. I know I've hurt you. The affairs, the credit-taking, all of it. But we built this together, Elena. You said it yourself, it's your code. Do you really want to see your own work destroyed because you're angry at me? I'm not angry. The words were quiet but absolute. Anger is hot. Anger is impulsive. What I feel when I look at you is cold and very, very patient. I feel the satisfaction of watching a plan come together after a decade of waiting. Marcus reached for her hand. She stepped back, the movement small but decisive. We can fix this. 50-50 split. Real partners this time. I'll step back from operations, you can run the tech side. I'll fire Jessica. I'll fire everyone if that's what you want. Just don't destroy me. Elena pulled her phone from her purse. A few taps and she held it up to show him the screen. A text message sent 3 days before the divorce papers were filed, finally dumping the dead weight. Sarah's out. I get the cash, she gets the cat. Going to upgrade to a model half her age by next month. Life begins at 42, brother. The message was to Mark Stevenson, his fraternity brother from Penn State. Marcus remembered typing it, remembered the bourbon he'd been drinking, remembered the satisfaction of announcing his freedom to someone who'd understand. How did you... I wrote the code, Marcus. The company phones run on servers I administer. I've seen every text, every email, every bank transfer you've made to your girlfriends for the last 5 years. She put the phone away and the motion was gentle, almost sad. I stayed because I took my vows seriously. Because I believed marriage was work and work was something I understood. But when you served me those divorce papers, when you tried to leave me with nothing after I gave you everything, that was the moment you stopped being my husband and became just another problem to solve. Marcus felt something crack in his chest, some foundational belief about his own cleverness giving way like rotted wood. What do you want? Money? I'll liquidate everything. My retirement accounts, the investment portfolio Robert set up. You can have it all. I don't want your money. Henry's voice came from behind them. Marcus turned to find the old man standing at the edge of the alcove, his cane resting against his hip. What my daughter wants is to never wonder for the rest of her life whether the next man she meets loves her or loves the idea of what she can give him. You made that impossible, Marcus. You made her doubt her own judgment. That's a wound that doesn't heal with apologies or equity splits. Marcus looked between them, father and daughter, united in a purpose he'd been too blind to see forming around him like walls of ice. The license. If you revoke it, the Pentagon will audit the source code. They'll see the derivative work. I'll go to prison for procurement fraud. Henry's expression didn't shift. Yes, just that. One word delivered with the certainty of gravity. 20 years, federal prison, my entire life gone. Then I suggest you sign the transfer documents and hope we're feeling generous about that retroactive license. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms hard enough to leave marks. The rage that had been building since the courtroom doors opened finally found its target. You set me up, both of you. This whole marriage was a trap from the beginning. Elena shook her head slowly. No, the marriage was real. I loved you, Marcus. I loved the man you were when we met, hungry, ambitious, but still human, still capable of seeing me as a partner instead of a tool. You're the one who changed. You're the one who decided that my contributions didn't matter, that my father's poverty made me lesser, that the women you slept with were somehow more valuable because they laughed at your jokes and didn't ask you to be better. Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly, and Marcus saw moisture gathering in her eyes before she blinked it away. The trap wasn't the marriage. The trap was giving you exactly what you wanted and watching you prove my father right about the kind of man you'd become. Henry stepped forward, reaching into his coat. Marcus tensed, some primal part of his brain still expecting a weapon. Instead, the old man pulled out a silver flash drive, holding it up to the light. This contains a forensic audit I commissioned 3 months ago. It details how you've been funneling company funds into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. $2.3 million over 4 years hidden in shell corporations and fake vendor contracts. That's not just civil embezzlement, Marcus. That's criminal tax evasion. The blood drained from Marcus's face. The Cayman accounts. He'd been so careful using Robert's contacts, routing everything through enough layers that the IRS couldn't possibly trace it. But Henry wasn't the IRS. Henry had resources Marcus hadn't even imagined. You had me investigated. I had my son-in-law investigated the week after the wedding, updated annually. You'd be surprised what a good forensic accountant can find when money is no object and patience is unlimited. Henry pocketed the flash drive. The choice is yours. Sign everything over to Elena, walk away with your freedom and whatever dignity you have left. Or fight us and I hand this drive to the FBI. They love cases like this. White-collar crime with clear evidence. Makes their conviction statistics look excellent. Marcus backed against the vending machine, the metal cold through his shirt. Trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. And somewhere beneath the panic and rage, a dark thought began to form. A plan he'd put in place 3 years ago during a cocaine-fueled paranoid episode he'd half forgotten until this moment. Protocol Krakatoa. The failsafe buried in the New Jersey server farm disguised as a backup power supply, but actually containing an electromagnetic pulse generator. He'd paid a hacker in Tallinn $75,000 in Bitcoin to install it, never really believing he'd use it. Insurance, he'd called it. A way to make sure that if the company ever turned against him, if the board tried to oust him, if anyone tried to steal what he'd built, they'd get nothing but slag and smoke. The trigger was on his phone. A fake calculator app that required a specific code sequence. Press the numbers confirm, and 60 seconds later every server in the New Jersey facility would be permanently destroyed. No recovery, no backup. The Pentagon contract would evaporate. The company would be worthless, and Elena would inherit nothing but debts and lawsuits. If he couldn't have it, nobody would. Marcus straightened, forcing his face into something like acceptance. Fine, I'll sign. Elena and Henry exchanged a glance, some wordless communication passing between them that Marcus couldn't decode. We'll meet back in the courtroom in 30 minutes. Elena's voice was steady, but Marcus thought he detected a hint of relief. She actually believed he was going to roll over, actually thought he was beaten. They returned to the courtroom in a procession that felt like a funeral march. Judge Parker had returned to the bench early, and Timothy Brooks sat at the plaintiff's table with documents already spread out before him. The public defender looked less nervous now, like he'd finally realized he was on the winning side. Robert met Marcus at the defense table, his expression grim. I drew up the transfer paperwork. It's bare bones but legally sound. You sign, she gets everything they promise, the license stays active through the Pentagon contract. Marcus took the pen Robert offered. A Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive, bought during the company's first profitable quarter. He'd thought it would be the pen that signed million-dollar deals. Instead, it would be the pen that signed away his empire. Timothy pushed a single sheet of legal pad paper across to the defense table. Handwritten, clearly done in haste, but the language was unambiguous. I, Marcus Stone, hereby transfer 100% of my equity in Stone Logistics, LLC, to Elena Blackwell Stone. I resign all executive positions effective immediately and waive all claims to marital assets. The signature line waited at the bottom like an open grave. Marcus's left hand picked up the pen. His right hand, hidden beneath the table, slid into his pocket and found his phone. The motion was smooth, practiced from 1,000 meetings where he'd checked messages while pretending to pay attention. He unlocked the screen with his thumbprint, opened the app folder labeled Utilities, found the calculator icon that wasn't quite the same shade of gray as the default iOS app. His left hand brought the pen to paper. His right thumb tapped the sequence. 6, 6, 6, 9, 9. The calculator interface vanished. The screen turned red, a warning that made his pulse spike with something between terror and exhilaration. Protocol Krakatoa. Warning: irreversible hardware failure imminent. Confirm/cancel. His thumb hovered over the confirm button. One tap. That's all it would take. 60 seconds and the servers would be molten scrap. The code, Elena's code, Henry's code, whoever the hell actually owned it would be gone. Unrecoverable. And they could have their empty shell of a company could watch the Pentagon lawyers descend like vultures could stand in the ruins of what they thought they'd won. Marcus's hand trembled, then steadied. He pressed confirm. The screen shifted to a countdown. 60 seconds, 59, 58. His left hand scrawled his signature across the paper, the letters jagged and aggressive. He slid it back across to Timothy, who picked it up and carried it to the bench like he was handling radioactive material. Judge Parker examined the document, nodded once, and reached for her stamp. The court accepts this addendum. The divorce is finalized, assets transferred as stipulated. Mr. Stone, you are to vacate all company premises by close of business today. Marcus stood buttoning his jacket. 42 seconds remaining. The phone felt hot in his pocket, or maybe that was just his imagination. I'm leaving now. He didn't look at Elena, didn't look at Henry, just turned and walked toward the exit, each step measured and calm, a man accepting defeat with dignity. 30 seconds. Robert followed, still talking something about paperwork and final signatures, but Marcus wasn't listening. The hallway stretched before him, marble and oak and fluorescent light, and all he could think about was getting to the elevator, getting to the street, getting somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here when the notifications started rolling in. 20 seconds. Marcus. Elena's voice stopped him 3 steps from the exit. He turned despite himself, and she was standing in the courtroom doorway, Henry beside her. But she wasn't looking triumphant. She looked sad, almost pitying. Aren't you going to check your phone? The words hit him like ice water. Marcus's hand froze halfway to his pocket. What? The Samson option. The dead man's switch. Usually those systems send a confirmation text when the remote trigger is received. Did you get yours? The courtroom went silent. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Marcus felt his throat close, his chest constrict, every cell in his body suddenly screaming danger in a language older than thought. I don't know what you're talking about. Elena took a step forward, then another. Her heels clicked against the floor in a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. The electromagnetic pulse device in the New Jersey server farm, Rack 4 Unit B, disguised as a backup UPS battery. You had it installed 3 years ago by a hacker named Dmitry Volkov, operating out of Tallinn under the handle Ghost. Cost you $75,000 in Bitcoin transferred through a mixer to avoid detection. Marcus's vision narrowed. The edges of the hallway went dark. How could you possibly? I run thermal audits on the servers every quarter. Standard procedure for data centers handling classified information. 6 months ago, Unit B started running 3.2 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding equipment. That's not much, but it's enough to notice if you're paying attention. She was close now, close enough that Marcus could see the faint lines around her eyes, the exhaustion buried beneath the calm. I opened it, saw the capacitors, the wiring, the remote receiver. Very sophisticated work. I did some research, found the dark web forums where Ghost advertises his services. Impressive portfolio. He's done similar installations for paranoid executives all over the world. Marcus backed against the wall, his hand finally pulling the phone from his pocket. The screen showed the countdown. 7 seconds. 6, 5. You couldn't have known. You couldn't have. I didn't disable it. The words were quiet, precise, each one a hammer strike. If I'd disconnected the device, your app would have shown an error. Offline status. You would have known your insurance policy was worthless. And I needed you to feel safe. Needed you to feel arrogant enough to actually press that button. The countdown hit 0. Marcus stared at the screen, waiting for the confirmation notification. Waiting for the distant alarms, the frantic phone calls, the beginning of the disaster he'd unleashed. Nothing happened. Henry stepped forward, his cane tapping against the floor. She rewired the output relay, redirected the pulse signal away from the hard drives and into a closed-loop transmitter. The old man's voice carried a teacher's patience, like he was explaining a watch mechanism to a particularly slow student. When you pressed confirm 30 seconds ago, you didn't trigger an electromagnetic pulse. You triggered a silent alarm. a very specific digital distress beacon that my daughter configured to send one message to one recipient. The courtroom doors burst open behind Marcus with enough force to make him jump. 4 men in navy windbreakers with FBI stenciled across the back in yellow letters poured through, followed by a 5th man in a charcoal suit carrying a reinforced briefcase. Marcus Stone, the lead agent, square jaw, buzz-cut eyes like flint, moved with the efficiency of someone who'd made 1,000 arrests and expected this one to go smoothly. "I'm Special Agent Derek Morrison, FBI Cybercrimes Division. You're under arrest for attempted destruction of federal property and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act." Marcus tried to back away. There was nowhere to go. The wall was solid behind him, agents on either side, and his phone, still clutched in his trembling hand, showed the calculator app interface that wasn't a calculator at all. "This is a setup. They trapped me. This whole thing was—" Morrison pulled handcuffs from his belt with the bored precision of a man who'd heard every excuse. "Sir, at 1:43 p.m. today you remotely triggered a device designed to destroy servers containing classified Department of Defense logistics data. We have the signal logs time-stamped and geolocated. You can explain your motivations to a federal prosecutor." The steel closed around Marcus's wrists with a sound like a door locking. Cold, final, irreversible. Robert Crane appeared at Marcus's elbow, his face the color of old newspaper. "I had no knowledge of this. Your Honor, I resign from this case effective immediately. I will be filing a motion to—" "Save it for the Bar Association hearing counselor." Morrison's voice cut through Robert's panic like a blade through fog. "We'll be interviewing you about your role in helping Mr. Stone establish those Cayman accounts. Might want to lawyer up yourself." They pulled Marcus toward the exit. He twisted, trying to look back at Elena, and she was standing in the center of the hallway watching him with that same terrible pity. "You set me up, from the beginning. The weak lawyer, the bad settlement, I gave you a choice." Her voice followed him down the hallway as the agents frog-marched him toward the elevator. "You could have signed those papers and walked away. Could have taken your freedom and rebuilt your life somewhere else. But you couldn't do it. Couldn't let go. Couldn't imagine a world where someone else had what you thought belonged to you." The elevator doors opened. They pushed Marcus inside, and he saw his reflection in the polished brass handcuffed, disheveled small. The doors started to close, but Henry's voice carried through the gap. "I told you, Marcus. I fix things. And you were broken long before my daughter met you." The doors sealed shut. The elevator descended, and through the brass reflection Marcus watched his face crumple, the facade finally shattering after holding so long it had become the man beneath. 3 months later, the trial lasted 6 days. Federal prosecutors brought evidence in neat boxes, offshore account records, emails with Ghost discussing the EMP installation, server logs showing the trigger signal, testimony from Pentagon auditors about the classified nature of the data Marcus had attempted to destroy. His public defender, Robert, had indeed been disbarred and was fighting his own charges, tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed the divorce had driven Marcus to temporary insanity. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, 72, legendary for her harsh sentencing in white-collar cases, didn't waste time with speeches. "Mr. Stone, you betrayed your wife, defrauded investors, evaded taxes, and attempted an act that could generously be described as corporate terrorism. I see no remorse, only entitlement. 18 years federal prison, $5 million in restitution, forfeiture of all remaining assets." Marcus barely heard it. He was looking at the gallery where Jessica Thornton sat with a hand on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant with a son she'd named Henry after the man who'd given her a job when Marcus had abandoned her. Elena sat beside Jessica, and the two women held hands like sisters, like survivors of the same war. The marshals led him away to begin a sentence that would take him past 60, past relevance, past the age where anyone would remember who Marcus Stone had been before he became a cautionary tale. Elena took control of the company in January, renaming it Blackwell Systems with herself as CEO. The stock didn't crash. Investors, it turned out, had more faith in the woman who wrote the code than the man who'd sold it. By March, she'd renegotiated the Pentagon contract, $600 million over 5 years, 40% more than Marcus had secured, and the general in charge of procurement told her the previous version had been inefficient, bloated, clearly designed by someone who didn't understand the underlying technology. Jessica became HR director, a position that felt like cosmic irony until Elena explained her reasoning to the board. She understands what it's like to be manipulated by powerful men. That makes her the perfect person to protect our employees from the same. Jessica's son was born in April. Henry James Thornton, 8 pounds 3 ounces, with his mother's eyes and a cry that suggested strong opinions about the world. Henry Blackwell visited the hospital, brought a vintage pocket watch, Omega 1943, worth $30,000, and placed it in the baby's tiny hand. When he's old enough, teach him what this means, not the money, the patience, the precision, the understanding that every moment counts. Henry turned 79 in May and showed no signs of slowing. His workshop in Chelsea moved from the Brooklyn storefront to the basement of a brownstone he'd owned for 40 years, but never mentioned, became a STEM education center for underprivileged kids. He taught watchmaking to teenagers from the Bronx, and Brooklyn showed them how broken things could be repaired if you had the patience to understand how they worked. Elena joined him most Saturdays, father and daughter, side by side at the workbench, and sometimes she'd catch him looking at her with an expression that mixed pride and grief in equal measure. "I wish your mother could see you now." Maria Blackwell had died when Elena was 12, a drunk driver on the Taconic Parkway who'd crossed the center line doing 70. Henry had built the trust fund the year after, determined that his daughter would never be vulnerable, never be dependent, never have to stay with a man, because leaving meant poverty. Elena squeezed her father's hand, careful of the arthritis that made his fingers stiff in cold weather. "She'd be proud of you too, Dad, for playing the long game, for teaching me that patience isn't weakness." Henry smiled, but it was a small thing, fragile as the springs and gears they worked with. Patience is the hardest lesson. Most people never learn it. They want everything now, immediately, before time reveals what should have been obvious from the start. He picked up the Patek Philippe pocket watch that Marcus had sold for $800. Elena had found it in an estate sale 2 years after the divorce, paid $52,000 to reclaim it. The watch had been Henry's father's, given to Henry on his 18th birthday, with an inscription inside the case: "Tempus omnia revelat." Time reveals all. They repaired it together over 6 Saturdays, replacing worn components, cleaning decades of accumulated grime, adjusting the escapement until the ticking was precise as a heartbeat. When they finished, Henry handed it to Elena. "Keep it. Pass it to your children when the time comes. Let it remind them that truth is patient. It waits, and eventually it always wins." Elena placed the watch on her office desk, where it ticked away the seconds while she built an empire her ex-husband had never understood. The company thrived. The Pentagon contract expanded. Forbes called for an interview, wanted to do a cover story about the quiet genius who'd outmaneuvered one of tech's most visible CEOs. She declined. Let the work speak. Let time do what time does best: reveal, resolve, restore. And in a federal prison in Coleman, Florida, Marcus Stone marked days on a wall he couldn't see, counting down years to a freedom that would release him into a world that had forgotten he existed. 10 years passed like water through cupped hands. Coleman Federal Correctional Institution released Marcus Stone on a Tuesday morning in March, parole granted for good behavior and completion of rehabilitation programs that taught him words like accountability and restitution without ever making him feel their weight. He walked through the gates at 52, with gray threading his hair and lines carved deep around his mouth that made him look like someone's regretful father. The halfway house in Orlando smelled of industrial cleaner and dreams deferred. Marcus shared a room with a former tax attorney who'd helped clients hide money in the Cook Islands, and they maintained the careful silence of men who understood that their past was currency best left unspent. The parole officer assigned to his case was a woman named Rodriguez, who'd shepherded 1,000 white-collar criminals back into society and believed maybe 3 of them had genuinely changed. She asked the same questions every month, checking boxes on forms that documented his transformation. Was he attending therapy? Maintaining employment? Avoiding contact with victims or former business associates? Marcus answered yes to everything because the alternative was another decade inside, watching his life shrink to the size of a cell. The job came through a re-entry program that specialized in placing ex-convicts where their skills wouldn't matter and their past couldn't hurt anyone. Ace Hardware in Winter Park hired him to stock shelves and cut keys, $14 an hour, and grateful for it. The store manager was a veteran named Pete who'd done time himself 20 years back, and he looked at Marcus's application with eyes that had seen this story before. "You gonna steal from me?" The question came flat, without judgment. "No, sir." "You gonna show up on time and do the work without complaining it's beneath you?" Marcus thought about the Italian suits hanging in a storage unit he couldn't afford to keep, the Rolex sold to pay legal fees, the business cards that once opened doors now worthless as monopoly money. "Yes, sir." Pete hired him on the spot, and Marcus spent his first week learning the difference between Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, while customers treated him like furniture that happened to know where the paint thinner lived. The therapy sessions happened every Wednesday in a strip mall counseling center wedged between a Vietnamese nail salon and a tax preparation office that only opened during filing season. Group therapy for men diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, led by a soft-voiced psychologist named Dr. Chen, who believed healing required first acknowledging the harm. Marcus sat in the circle and listened to men confess their sins, affairs that destroyed families, financial manipulations that ruined partners, abuse disguised as ambition. When his turn came, he delivered the script he'd perfected in prison. "I measured my worth by what I owned instead of who I was. I hurt people because I couldn't see past my own reflection. I'm working to become someone who adds value instead of extracting it." Dr. Chen nodded with cautious approval. The other men murmured understanding, and Marcus felt the familiar hollowness of performing emotions he couldn't quite access, saying words that were true without feeling their truth. But he kept showing up, kept reciting the liturgy of redemption, kept hoping that eventually the performance would become the reality, that you could fake authenticity long enough for it to take root. Night classes at Valencia Community College gave structure to evenings that otherwise stretched empty and dangerous. Business fundamentals taught by adjunct professors who'd never built companies themselves but understood theory well enough to guide people through remedial coursework. Marcus sat in the back row with teenagers working toward GEDs and middle-aged career changers, hoping desperation looked like initiative. One of his classmates was a kid named Brandon, 19, angry, covered in tattoos that documented bad decisions made permanent. The kid had fire in him, the kind Marcus recognized from his own youth. Hunger that could build empires or burn them down depending on who held the match. Brandon fought with everyone, challenged the professor on grading, accused classmates of cheating when their scores exceeded his. Got in Marcus's face one night after class when a group project went sideways, fists clenched and ready to solve problems the way he'd learned on streets that didn't reward patience. Marcus stood his ground, keeping his voice level. "You can fight me if it makes you feel better, but I spent 10 years in federal prison learning that violence is what people choose when they run out of smarter options. You seem smarter than that." The fight drained out of Brandon like air from a punctured tire, his fists unclenched. 10 years. What did you do?" They talked in the parking lot while Brandon chain-smoked cigarettes he couldn't afford, and Marcus told him a version of the truth that had been edited for maximum impact. Corporate fraud, embezzlement, the arrogance of believing rules applied to other people. The kid listened with the intensity of someone hearing their own future described in past tense. "You regret it." The question hung in the humid Florida air between them, and Marcus considered lying. Considered giving the answer that parole boards and therapy groups and well-meaning strangers wanted to hear. Instead, he went with something closer to honesty. "I regret getting caught. I regret losing everything. Whether I regret the choices themselves or just their consequences, I honestly don't know. But I know I can't make those choices again, even if I wanted to, because nobody trusts a con man after he's been caught. So I might as well try being someone different." Brandon processed this with the seriousness of youth encountering adult complexity for the first time. That's dark, man. Yeah, but it's true. And truth is better than whatever pretty lie you tell yourself until you're sitting in a federal courtroom watching your life get sentenced to 18 years. Something shifted in Brandon after that conversation. He started showing up to class early, turned in assignments on time. When he passed the semester with a B-, he shook Marcus's hand with a grip that lasted too long, gratitude pouring from a kid who'd probably never had someone believe in him without wanting something in return. Marcus felt a strange flutter in his chest watching Brandon walk away. Not pride exactly, but recognition that maybe he could be useful in ways that didn't require destroying people. That teaching someone to avoid his mistakes held more value than anything he'd built in his previous life. The years accumulated slowly. Parole restrictions loosened incrementally, granting freedoms that felt less like victories and more like acknowledgments that he'd survived long enough to earn back basic dignities. He could travel within Florida, could use the internet without supervision, could begin rebuilding something that resembled a life rather than just an existence. 5 years into parole, a lawyer's letter arrived at his apartment with a return address in Manhattan. Marcus stared at the envelope for 10 minutes before opening it, certain it was another lawsuit, another demand for restitution he couldn't possibly pay. Instead, he found a request for a meeting. Elena Blackwell wished to speak with him regarding a matter of inheritance. His first instinct was to ignore it. Elena had made herself clear a decade ago he owed her absence distance the gift of becoming someone she didn't have to think about. But the letter came through official channels, formal and proper, suggesting this was business, rather than reopening wounds that had finally begun to scar. He took a Greyhound to New York, watching the landscape shift from palmetto scrub to pine forests to the dense urban sprawl of the Northeast Corridor. The city had changed in ways both dramatic and subtle. Williamsburg looked nothing like he remembered boutiques where warehouses had been coffee shops charging prices that would have been criminal in his youth. Battery Park on a Sunday morning in October. Elena waited on a bench overlooking the harbor, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a month but didn't advertise it. She looked older but not diminished, 51, with gray threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that suggested a life lived with more laughter than he'd allowed her during their marriage. She stood when he approached but didn't offer her hand. The boundaries were clear without being hostile. "Thank you for coming." Her voice carried no warmth but no anger either. Neutral, professional, the tone of someone conducting necessary business with minimal emotional expenditure. Marcus nodded, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses or apologies she'd already made clear she didn't want. Elena handed him an envelope, the paper heavy and expensive in a way that reminded him of wedding invitations and legal summons. "My father died 6 months ago. He left you something in his will. Against my advice, I should mention. But he was very specific about his wishes, and I promised to honor them." The words landed like stones in still water. Henry Blackwell dead. The man who'd orchestrated Marcus's destruction and somehow made it feel like justice rather than revenge. Marcus opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a letter in Henry's careful script, the handwriting of someone who'd spent decades making tiny adjustments to delicate mechanisms and had learned that precision mattered. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm dead and you're still trying. That's worth something. This money comes with one requirement. Use it to start a scholarship program for young people who've made serious mistakes. Juvenile offenders. Kids aging out of the system with records that will follow them forever. Give them what you never had a second chance that comes with accountability instead of excuses. I don't forgive you. Forgiveness isn't mine to grant. But I believe people are mechanisms that can sometimes be repaired if the broken parts are willing to be replaced. Consider this your toolbox. What you build with it is between you and whatever conscience you've managed to develop. Don't thank me. Thank Elena for honoring my wishes when she had every reason to let this letter burn. Henry Blackwell." Marcus read it twice, then looked at Elena with questions crowding his throat like prisoners at a door that wouldn't open. Why would he do this? Elena stared at the water where tugboats pushed barges toward destinations unknown and unknowable. Because he spent 50 years repairing broken things, and he believed that with the right tools and enough patience some of them could work again. Not all, not even most, but some. She turned to face him fully for the first time, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that wasn't forgiveness, but wasn't hatred either. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition that he existed and had changed and that neither fact altered what he'd done. "I don't forgive you, Marcus. I never will. What you did to me, to Jessica, to everyone who trusted you, that's yours to carry for the rest of your life. But my father believed in giving people tools and seeing what they built. This is your toolbox. What you construct with it is between you and your conscience." She picked up her purse, preparing to leave, and Marcus felt the moment slipping away like water through those same cupped hands. "How are you?" The question came out smaller than he'd intended, but Elena answered it with surprising gentleness. "I'm well. The company has 1,200 employees. My children are healthy. My husband is kind. I built something real from the ruins you left behind, and it's better than anything we had together, because it's founded on truth instead of theft." She paused, and for just a moment something like sadness flickered across her face. "I hope you find something similar. Not with me, obviously, but somewhere, with someone. A life that doesn't require taking from others to feel full." Then she walked away, and Marcus watched her disappear into the Sunday morning crowd of joggers and tourists and people living lives that didn't include him. He looked down at the check in his hands, $50,000 more money than he'd seen in a decade, and felt the weight of Henry's final test settling over his shoulders like a coat he couldn't remove. The Blackwell Second Chances Fund, launched 18 months later, incorporated as a nonprofit with Marcus as executive director and a board of advisors drawn from social workers and former public defenders who understood that punishment without redemption just created better criminals. The scholarship paid for education, job training, counseling for teenagers who'd committed crimes but hadn't yet calcified into permanent offenders. Marcus interviewed applicants himself, sitting across folding tables in community centers and juvenile facilities, looking for the spark he'd seen in Brandon, the hunger that could be redirected, the intelligence that could be focused on building instead of breaking. He told them his story, the unvarnished truth about embezzlement and affairs and the arrogance that had cost him everything, and watched them decide whether they wanted to follow his path or forge their own. Most failed. Recidivism was a virus that infected through proximity and circumstance, and many of the kids Marcus tried to help ended up back inside before their 20th birthdays. But some made it. A girl named Keisha, who'd been arrested for grand theft auto at 16, graduated from a technical college and became a diesel mechanic. A boy named Deshaun, who'd done 2 years for armed robbery, got his MBA and started a nonprofit teaching financial literacy in underserved communities. They sent emails years later, messages of gratitude that Marcus kept in a folder on his laptop and read when the weight of what he'd destroyed threatened to crush him under its accumulating mass. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for showing me that mistakes don't have to be permanent. Thank you for proving that people can change even if the change comes too late to save what they broke." Marcus turned 65 and qualified for Social Security. Turned 70 and received a gold watch from Ace Hardware for 20 years of service, a retirement gift for a man who couldn't afford to retire. The watch was a Timex, simple and functional, worth maybe $30. He wore it every day and maintained it with obsessive care, replacing the battery before it died, cleaning the band when it tarnished, treating it with the attention Henry Blackwell had tried to teach him decades ago, when a different watch had been the test Marcus failed. The Patek Philippe pocket watch appeared occasionally in photographs Marcus found online when he typed Elena's name into search engines he knew he should avoid. Forbes had done a cover story 5 years after the divorce. The quiet genius who rebuilt an empire. And the watch sat visible on her desk in the photograph, still keeping time for someone who'd learned its lessons and lived them daily. Marcus closed those browser windows and went to bed knowing he'd never own a watch that valuable again. Never be trusted with something precious. Never have the chance to prove he'd learned from breaking what couldn't be replaced. But he kept the Timex running, kept showing up to work even after his knees complained and his back ached, and younger employees looked at him with pity, reserved for old men who'd never amounted to anything. Kept managing the scholarship fund from his one-bedroom apartment that never got nicer because nice things reminded him of who he'd been when possessions mattered more than people. He helped 63 kids over 15 years, watched 12 of them succeed in ways that seemed impossible given where they'd started. Attended 3 college graduations where former felons walked across stages to receive degrees that opened doors their records should have locked forever. And sometimes standing in the back of those auditoriums while families cheered, Marcus felt something close to purpose. Not redemption, that was too grand a word for what he'd managed, but usefulness. The recognition that he could add small value to a world from which he'd once only extracted. The newspaper arrived on a Tuesday, and Marcus almost missed the obituary buried on page 8 of the business section. Henry James Blackwell, 80, philanthropist and former naval engineer. The article detailed patents sold to the Pentagon 40 years earlier. Charitable work funding STEM education for underprivileged youth. A daughter, Elena Blackwell Mercer, CEO of Blackwell Systems. Grandchildren who would inherit his legacy of precision and patience. Marcus read it 3 times, then set the paper down with hands that had started shaking without his permission. Henry dead. The man who'd seen through Marcus from the beginning. Who'd built a decade-long trap and sprung it with the patience of someone who understood that time revealed all truths eventually. Who'd given Marcus a final chance even after every reason to believe he didn't deserve one. He wanted to attend the funeral, wanted to stand in the back of whatever church or chapel they'd chosen and pay respects to a man who'd destroyed him and somehow made it feel like salvation. But he knew his presence would be violation rather than tribute. That Elena had earned the right to bury her father without the ghost of her worst mistake lurking in the shadows. So Marcus stayed in Florida and worked his shift and went home to his empty apartment where he sat in the dark and cried for the first time in 15 years. Not for himself, not for what he'd lost, but for Henry Blackwell, who'd spent 80 years fixing broken things and had extended that grace even to mechanisms too damaged to deserve repair. 3 months later, Marcus turned 71. The scholarship fund had helped its 100th applicant, a milestone that felt both significant and insufficient given the ocean of need that existed beyond what his small operation could address. He attended a therapy session where Dr. Chen asked the question she'd been asking for 16 years. Do you think you've changed, Marcus? Really changed, not just learned to perform change convincingly. He considered this with the care it deserved, looking back across 2 decades of parole and poverty and small acts of service that might constitute penance if he squinted hard enough. I think I became what I practiced. In my first life, I practiced taking, extracting value from people and situations without considering cost. So I became a thief even when what I stole was legal. He paused, gathering thoughts that still felt slippery after all these years. In this life, I practice giving what I can to people who need it. Maybe that makes me generous, or maybe it just makes me a thief who ran out of things to steal and had to find a different way to matter. I honestly don't know, but I know I can't go back, so I might as well keep going forward. Dr. Chen smiled, and for the first time in 16 years, it looked genuine rather than professionally encouraging. That's the most honest thing you've ever said in this room. Marcus drove home along familiar streets where nothing dramatic had ever happened, and nothing dramatic ever would. He parked his 20-year-old Toyota in a spot he'd occupied for the past decade, walked up stairs that creaked under his weight, unlocked a door that protected nothing valuable but kept the outside world at a manageable distance. His apartment held the accumulated evidence of a small life lived carefully. Furniture from Goodwill, books from library sales, a laptop old enough to run slowly but new enough to function. And on the dresser, the Timex watch he removed each night and wound with the same attention Henry Blackwell had given to timepieces worth 1,000 times as much. Marcus picked up the watch, feeling its modest weight, and thought about the Patek Philippe he'd sold for $800 to buy golf clubs he'd used maybe twice. About Elena reclaiming it years later for $52,000 because some things were worth saving even after careless hands had discarded them. About Henry's final gift, not forgiveness, but tools. Not absolution, but opportunity. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, measuring seconds that accumulated into minutes that became hours that stretched into whatever remained of a life that had once promised so much and delivered so little. But it kept time honestly, without pretension, and maybe that was enough. Maybe after everything, honest timekeeping was all anyone could ask from a mechanism that had been broken and poorly repaired, but still functioned well enough to serve its purpose. Marcus set the watch on the dresser and climbed into bed another day, logged in the long accounting of redemption that would never quite balance but might eventually approach something like equilibrium. Tomorrow he'd wake up and go to work and help a kid fill out a scholarship application and maintain the small routines that constituted a life worth living if you didn't measure it against what might have been. Time reveals all Henry had believed, and Marcus spent his remaining years proving the old man right, one maintained watch and one helped kid, and one honest day at a time until time finished its revelation and moved on to other truths in need of exposure.